Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today we finally have the start of spoiler season for AetherDrift. A ton of new cards were spoiled today. We have so much to go through. Also, all of the new mechanics, we finally have details concerning them. We know exactly how they work, and I'm going to explain all of that to you guys. So we have a lot to get through. So we're going to dive right in. Before we do, please like the video. It helps me get it out to so many more people. I appreciate it more than I can express with words. Also, please subscribe if you're new so you never miss an upload. Tons of crazy spoiler content coming for this set. And honestly, this set is looking kinda gnarly already. I don't think you guys are ready. Catch me live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/quarantinecapricorn. Because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. Now let's dive right in. We're going to start with detailing some of the mechanics. We're going to specifically detail what's called start your engines. A bunch of cards have this listed almost like a keyword within the text. A start your engines ability. If you play a card with start your engines, it puts you at speed level 1. From that point on, every single time you have a turn in which your opponent loses life in any way, you're allowed to increase your speed by 1. Only a max of 1 speed increase per turn. It has to happen on your turn specifically. And then if you get to a speed 4, that's what's called max speed. And there are a bunch of cards in this set that have max speed something. So if you get to max speed, it turns on all of those abilities. And here we can see another card representing max speed at level 4. So not only do we have max speed, but it's also insinuated, we don't know for sure, but it's insinuated by the way some of the cards are worded, that there will also be benefits on certain cards as you're leveling up speed, not just when you get to max speed. Most of the payoffs we've seen so far are strictly happening at max speed, but it seems like there are going to be ways to get value as you level up your speed, depending on what your speed level is at any given time and stuff like that. We're going to have to wait until we get more spoilers to know for sure, but we'll have another video tomorrow with all of the new spoilers that drop tomorrow, so look forward to that. We're going to move right on here, and we're going to talk about very quickly the fact that the common dual land cycle within this set are the gain life lands. They enter tap, they gain you a life, and there's one for every single color combination. These aren't super impressive, but the art is pretty interesting, so I still wanted to go through them quickly and show you guys. It shows a lot of the highways going through a lot of the planes that this set is taking place on, and they look pretty cool. And it's just nice to know that we have a set of common dual lands for every single color pair, so that when we're playing limited, you know, it's going to be much more easy to use 2-color, 3-color decks in a limited environment. But we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about another cycle of cards in this set, a cycle of lands. These are uncommon lands, and they're basically like vehicle lands or mount lands. I guess we'll call them pilot lands, right? They enter tapped unless you control a mount or vehicle. They tap for a mana of a specific color, and then you can pay 1 mana of that color and 1 colorless, tap, sacrifice the land to create a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token that saddles mounts and crews vehicles as though its power is 2 greater than what its power actually is. So you get a 1/1 that can crew things up to a crew 3 cost, or you know, also mount things as well. That didn't come out right, did it? But yeah, I think this is really cool because if you're in a deck that has a lot of mounts or vehicles, these are just strictly better than basics, right? They're going to come into play untapped almost all the time. Maybe not on turn 1, so you have to be a little bit careful. But I kind of love that. I kind of love that if your deck is wide enough with mounts and vehicles, these are just strict upgrades to basics and can give you pilots a little bit later. We have 1 in each color here, so here's the blue one. Here's the black one called Foul Roads. The red one is Rocky Roads, and then the green one is Wild Roads. And one of the problems we've had with vehicles in the past is if you play too many vehicles, you don't have ways to crew them. And if you know, your opponent kills your creatures and you run out of ways to crew them, they're all just sitting there and doing nothing. So having a cycle of uncommon lands like this that helps you when you're in a situation like that and you have a bunch of vehicles that you don't have pilots for, you can actually turn one of your lands basically into a pilot for the rest of the game. I kind of like that. But speaking of lands, we also get a rare cycle of lands in this set. We're getting the rest of the verges. These are all of the enemy color verges. We already have all of the allied color verges in standard. But man, I've been missing the enemy color Verges so much. This one in particular, Bleachbone Verge, the fact that it gives black no matter what, and it's the white that turns on if you control a plains or a swamp, I think is to the benefit of a card like this. If you're playing something like a Nurturing Pixie deck, you can play your Hopeless Nightmare on turn 1, and then later on unlock the ability for this to make white so that you can play your Nurturing Pixie. So I think the order in which you get the colors off of these lands is very important. We also have River Pyre Verge, which is the Izzet one, and it starts by giving you red and later gives you blue. We have Sunbillow Verge, which is the Boros one. It starts out giving you white and later gives you red. I think this is the one that's going to be a little bit of a bummer for all of those Boros aggro decks out there, because most of the time you want red before white in those decks, but as someone who doesn't like to face those decks, I'm happy to see it ordered this way. We've also got Wastewood Verge. This one gives you green first, and I think that's super important because in Golgari decks you can play your Llanowar Elf on turn 1 and then still be able to get black mana out of this later, which is awesome. You could theoretically play a Llanowar Elf on turn 1, a black source on turn 2, and tap them all to play a 3-drop that takes 2 black to cast. And there aren't very many playlines that allow for something like that in Standard at the moment. So really cool that you get the green first, I think. And then Willow Rush Verge is the Simic Verge, and it gives you blue first. But we're going to move on to the Aether Spark. We finally know what the Aether Spark does, and it's kind of looking nuts. 4 mana for a 4 loyalty legendary artifact planeswalker equipment. So the very first thing I want to mention is just the fact that this is an artifact. It counts as an artifact, but it's also a planeswalker and has loyalty. I think that might be the first time we've seen that. There might have been a Karn planeswalker in the past that was similar, but it gets even crazier. It has a static ability. As long as the Aether Spark is attached to a creature, it can't be attacked, and has whenever equipped creature deals combat damage during your turn, put that many loyalty counters on the Aether Spark. So this might be one of the only planeswalkers that has a really good built-in way to protect itself from your opponent attacking it and getting rid of its loyalty counters, because as long as it's equipped to one of your creature, they can't attack it like a normal planeswalker. They can't remove loyalty counters from it through combat, which is kind of a hidden way of protecting it, which is really cool. You can also uptick this 1 loyalty and attach it to up to 1 target creature you control, and put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. So it's not just do nothing, it's going to put a counter on that creature, and then like the static says, whenever that creature deals combat damage during your turn, you get to put that many loyalty counters on the Aether Spark. The thing to remember about the ability that's kind of crazy and easy to overlook is the fact that it doesn't have to deal combat damage to an opponent. It can deal combat damage to literally anything. So if it attacks and gets blocked by a creature and kills something, it's still dealing combat damage. It's still going to get a ton of loyalty counters on it. And it has a -5 ability to draw 2 cards, which is nuts. So if you can just attach this and swing in with a 5-drop, you can get enough loyalty, or a 5 power creature rather, you can get enough loyalty every single turn to draw another 2 cards every single turn, which is kind of bananas. But then it has an ultimate ability, -10 loyalty, to add 10 mana of any one color, which seems kind of crazy to me. Again, because you can get a ton of loyalty on this in one fell swoop, just from doing damage in combat, and you don't have to get through and hit the opponent. I don't know, man. It kind of makes this card nuts, and you get to protect the Aether Spark by having it equipped. I feel like this card is just ready to be broken. So if you have any ideas about specifically how you'd use it, what creatures it might be best with, definitely let me know in the comments. But I feel like this card is just begging to be broken. We're absolutely going to try and do that. But for now, we're going to move on to the Apocalypse Runner. This is a 6/5 vehicle for 4 mana in the colors of Rakdos. You can tap it, and target creature you control with power 2 or less gains lifelink until end of turn, and can't be blocked this turn. And then it has crew 3, so you can crew it with anything that has 3 power or more. Honestly, this is pretty good for an uncommon. It can be a big creature a little bit later in the game if you need it, but even if you're not crewing it to attack or block, you get this ability to kind of start swinging the game when it comes to racing your opponent by giving something lifelink and making sure that they can't block it. Pretty interesting card. I like that it has the versatility of having the ability or being able to become this body. In fact, technically you could turn this into a blocker on your opponent's turn, block something, and then after blockers are declared, use this to give one of your other creatures with power 2 or less lifelink that is also blocking. So even though the unblockability won't matter, the lifelink will still matter, and you'll gain some life on block with that other creature that has power 2 or less. That's an interesting way to use this. I'm excited to use a card like this in Limited. But next up, we've got Rocketeer Boost Buggy, a 3/2 vehicle for 2 mana in the colors of Gruul. And whenever this vehicle attacks, you get to create a treasure token. That's scary and awesome. It crews for only 1, and it has an Exhaust ability. For those of you who don't know, Exhaust is another one of the new abilities in this set. And what Exhaust means is if you use the Exhaust ability, you can only use it once for the entire game. You can never use it again. But this isn't an alchemy card, right? It doesn't track things perpetually, so there is a way around that. If you use an Exhaust ability on something and then you somehow sacrifice it, or it dies to removal or combat or whatever, and then you get it back out of the graveyard later, the game state is going to think it's a new copy of the card, and so you're going to be able to use that Exhaust ability again. The same is true if you flicker this thing and it re-enters play, it's going to lose track of its Exhaust ability. You'll be able to use it again, or even if you bounce it to your hand and replay it. So there are ways around Exhaust, and you better believe I'm going to explore all of them as soon as this set hits, because I'm ready to brew. But this Exhaust ability in particular costs 3 colorless mana, and this vehicle becomes an artifact creature. Put a +1/+1 counter on it. So it doesn't say until end of turn. It just becomes an artifact creature forever and gets a +1/+1 counter. So in the case of this Exhaust ability, it's not really something you want to activate multiple times, so you're not going to want to like sacrifice it, bring it back so that you have access to it. It's still something to keep in mind for some of the future Exhaust cards we're going to talk about, because most of the Exhaust abilities sort of act almost like a spell or a one-time ability that you really would love to trigger multiple times, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But this thing just being a 3/2 vehicle that can give you treasure tokens, and then a little bit later in the game when you don't have anything to crew it, can just basically crew itself and make itself bigger and still give you treasure tokens, seems pretty good. Next up, we've got Vinwexit Verbose Host. This is a 0/4 legendary creature homunculus for 1 blue and 1, and it has that start your engines ability that we were talking about. So if you have no speed, it starts at speed 1, and each turn that each one of your turns that your opponent loses life, you get to increase that speed by 1 up to a maximum of 4. You have no maximum hand size no matter what if Vinwexit is on the battlefield, but if you're at max speed, if you would draw a card, you draw 2 cards instead. This card actually seems kind of nuts. It's a really good play early against aggro decks, and aggro is everywhere in Standard right now. So just being a decent defender that they probably have to blow a bunch of their resources getting rid of can be kind of nuts. And then if they don't, if you get to a point where you're at max speed of 4, every single card drawn draws you 2 cards instead. That's going to count your draw for the turn, but it's also going to count all of the ways in which you can draw cards with spells and abilities. Every single card you draw is going to draw you 2. And don't confuse it with every time you draw cards, you draw an extra card. That's not how it works. For every single card you would draw, you draw 2 instead. So if you play a spell that makes you draw 3 cards, it's going to let you draw 6, which is just bananas. Absolutely bananas. The fact that we get that ability on a creature that's actually not useless early because of all the aggro that's everywhere in Standard right now, it's kind of awesome. Even just as a way to start your engines early to get there for other cards as well that have max speed so that you can start as early as turn 2, that's a little bit of extra value built in as well. So I really like Vinwexit. I'm excited to try and brew with him. But next up, we've got Lagorin, Soul of Alakria. This is a 1/1 legendary beast mount with flying for 2 mana in the colors of Selesnya. It saddles for just 1, and whenever Lagorin attacks while saddled, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target mounts and or vehicles. It doesn't say other, so you can actually put one of the +1/+1 counters on Lagorin itself. So every time it swings in, the first time it swings in, it's going to swing in as a 2/2 flyer for 2, which is already pretty good. and spit out a counter on something else, and then every single turn that it swings in after that, it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, still have flying, still be able to swing in without anything to saddle it later on. So if you get it to be a 6/6 or 7/7 flyer, but you lose your other creatures and don't have a way to saddle it, like, you can still swing with a 6/6 or 7/7 flyer. It's not a vehicle, it's a mount, and you just don't get to trigger the +1/+1 counters that turn, but you can still close out the game, which is kind of nuts. But being able to spit an extra counter on another mount or vehicle is pretty awesome as well. And then, you know, getting the versatility of not even having to put the counters on this at all. If you have 2 or more other mounts or vehicles, you can split it up on other things as well. All in all, this just seems kind of nuts. It is an uncommon. I think it's going to be a prime pick for certain archetypes within Limited, and I'm excited to explore that. But next up, we've got Ranger's AetherHive. This is a 3/5 artifact vehicle with Vigilance for 3 mana in the colors of Simic. It crews for just 1, and whenever you activate an Exhaust ability, you create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. So this probably goes in a deck that hybridizes, you know, using vehicle synergies with exhaust cards. The more exhaust cards you have, the better this is going to get. Give you a bunch of 1/1 flyers. Not only are those good for maybe closing out the game by pinging your opponent, but you can use them to crew the AetherHive itself or crew your other vehicles, which is really nice. So a lot of ways to synergize with this one. But next up, we've got Loot the Pathfinder, a new loot card. This might be the best one we've seen so far, and I think it's way better than it looks. It's a 2/4 legendary Beast Noble for 5 mana in the colors of Temur, and I think that 5 mana cost is going to scare off a lot of people from wanting to use this, but the card is actually bonkers. 2/4 double strike, Vigilance, Haste, and has 3 different exhaust abilities. So one is you pay green and tap loot to add 3 mana of any one color. The other one is to pay 1 blue mana and tap loot to draw 3 cards. And the other one is to pay 1 red mana and tap loot to deal 3 damage to any target. So he basically has a Lightning Bolt, Ancestral Recall, and Black Lotus just stapled to him that you can activate at any time. Granted, you need to play a 5-drop creature before you get access to those abilities, but still, 1 blue mana to draw 3 cards is bananas. 1 red mana to just deal 3 damage. You can kill your opponent that way. You can remove a threat. Just insane. Granted, the green one isn't truly a Black Lotus ability because it's going to cost you 1 mana to activate, but still, getting 3 mana of any one color is pretty powerful, and I think that's the one that makes this the most usable, because you could play this when you have 6 mana available, swing in with Vigilance, with Haste right away, hit for 4 damage because of the double strike, and then spend that 6th mana to give you 3 mana back for your second main phase, and still play another 3-drop. So the fact that it kind of gives you 2 mana back the turn you play it if you have 6 mana available almost makes it like a 4-drop in some cases. And I definitely think there's going to be a deck out there that takes advantage of a card like this. The one thing that makes this card super broken, and I cannot wait to brew this archetype more when this set drops, is Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Imagine exiling this from your graveyard with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, and now every single creature in your deck that has a +1/+1 counter on it gets all of these exhaust abilities. It doesn't matter if you can only tap a creature once to Ancestral Recall, if every single creature can do it once. That's bananas. This card with Soul Cauldron is bananas. That might be the first deck that we brew, because it's just absolutely bonkers. You guys that have been watching the channel for a while know that I love my Soul Cauldron, and I'm gonna absolutely love breaking this guy wide open with it. Next up, we have Night Market. This is a common land. It enters tapped, and as it enters, you get to choose a color. You can tap it for a mana of the chosen color. You can also cycle it for 3 and just draw a card. So this is definitely meant for Limited. You know, this is going to be color fixing to make sure you can get to the amount of fixing you need for your 2 or even 3 color decks in Limited. But the fact that you can cycle it later in the game, get a card for it if you don't need the land, does make it a little bit better. Next up, we've got Mendicant Core Guidelight, a star power 3 toughness legendary artifact creature robot for 2 mana in the colors of Azorius. Mendicant Core's power is equal to the number of artifacts you control. And then it also has start your engines, so it'll put you at speed 1 when you play it, and then you'll be able to go up to a max of speed 4 if you make your opponent lose life on your turns. And once you get there, it has a max speed ability. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, you may pay 1. If you do, copy it. This is actually kind of insane. Just the fact that it's got a high power if you're going super wide with artifacts is already pretty good for a 2-drop. It helps you get to your max speed sooner, but being able to make copies of your artifacts just seems absolutely insane. Granted, they can't be artifacts that are already down on the battlefield. You have to be playing them after you hit max speed, but still pretty nuts. You can play a creature on turn 1, and then play this on turn 2, swing in, and already be at speed 2, so that theoretically you could get to speed 4 on turn 4 and have your entire turn with all of your mana left to you to use whatever you want, play whatever you want, and utilize max speed for the entire turn and every turn after that, which could be kind of bananas in the right decks. So it'll be interesting to see if we get some kind of an Azorius or a 3-color artifact aggro deck that uses a card like this to just get to max speed super quick and just start vomiting out, doubling all of your crazy artifact creatures that you play. Or maybe there's another way to use this where we can start making copies of really substantial artifacts that aren't necessarily cheap. There's a lot to explore for sure, but if you have ideas about how you want to use Mendicant Core, definitely let me know in the comments. I think this card is so close to the possibility of maybe being broken, and we gotta get there. We definitely gotta get there. But next up, we've got Avishkar Raceway. This is another colorless land, another common. It has you start your engines, so you'll start at speed 1, and it has another ability if you get to max speed at speed 4. You can tap it for just a colorless mana no matter what, and it's an untapped land, which is really nice. But if you get to max speed, you can pay 3 mana and tap this to discard a card and then draw a card, which honestly could be pretty good. Getting to cycle through your deck a little bit later in the game in Limited is nice, and certain decks are going to want access to being able to put cards into their graveyard for certain reasons. Being able to do that with a land that's helping you curve out as well, you know, during the early turns, but then just turns into your discard outlet a little bit later on, draws you a card to replace the thing that you're discarding. It could see some play. We'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got Winter Cursed Rider. I think this card is insane. This is a 3/2 legendary human warlock with ward pay 2 life for 2 mana in the colors of Dimir. Clearly, Winter is now possessed by Valgavoth, and that is sad. But all artifacts you control have ward pay 2 life, so if you're jamming this on an artifact aggro deck, a board state with a ton of artifacts, all of them having ward pay 2 life is nuts. Basically have to get rid of Winter first before you can get rid of all the other artifacts, or at least before you can target them. But then Winter has an exhaust ability, and this is a perfect example of an ability I'd like to find a loophole to use multiple times in the same game. You pay 4 mana, 1 black, 1 blue, and 2. Tap it, exile X artifact cards from your graveyard, and each other non-artifact creature gets -X until end of turn. There's a few different things I wanted to note. So it's an exhaust ability. You can only use it once in the entire game, but again, just like we stated earlier in this video, you can get around that by bringing it back from the graveyard and using the exhaust ability again, or bouncing it and replaying it, or flickering it, or any of those things. And I definitely want to brew something that does that with Winter, but there are a couple things about this card that are easy to overlook that I want to point out. First of all, each other non-artifact creature gets -X. So if you're running a deck that's full of artifact creatures, you kind of get to one-sided board wipe. It doesn't hit any of your stuff, which is awesome. But if your opponent's running a bunch of artifact creatures, it also won't hit those. So something to keep in mind. Another thing is to key in on that word that says each other non-artifact creature. So even though that Winter is not an artifact himself, it says other. So it's not going to hit Winter. No matter what you do when you use Winter's exhaust ability, you're going to get to keep Winter alive and to fight another day and to keep that ward pay 2 life ability active, which is really, really nice. You do have to exile X artifact cards from your graveyard to use this ability though, And that makes it a little bit tricky because you're going to want a deck that just fills up the graveyard with artifacts quick, but also puts out a bunch of artifact creatures that can dodge this one-sided sweeper to get value off of it. And if you're trying to reuse that ability over and over and over, you're going to need even more things in your graveyard to exile with repeated uses. So trying to brew some sort of flicker deck with Winter actually seems a little bit more difficult than I otherwise might have thought at first glance. I still think it might be worth exploring. I think this card's going to end up being a little bit more powerful than people will give it credit for at first. But next up, we've got Amonkhet Raceway. This is another colorless land, but it is an uncommon. It has Start Your Engines, so it's going to start you out at speed 1, and then get another ability when you reach that max speed of 4. It taps for a colorless mana no matter what, but when you are at max speed, you can tap it to give target creature haste until end of turn. That's honestly kind of nuts in an aggro deck. I almost feel like, I mean, most aggro decks really don't want to waste too many land slots on colorless lands. Sometimes it can force you into very difficult board states where you can't play the things you want to play. That being said, I would be very surprised if this card didn't at least show up as a one-of in every monocolor aggro deck under the sun, because you can afford to run one as long as you're not taking the risk of having multiple colorless lands in play. And then just like, if you're playing aggro, you're getting to max speed super quick no matter what. So just having the ability of tapping your land to give anything haste seems kind of nuts. You can use it every single turn. So that's my theory. I think this is going to be a one-of in a lot of different aggro decks. The more colors you start to add into the equation, the harder it gets to play a colorless land like this. But I also wouldn't be surprised if somewhere down the line, colorless decks end up coming back into Magic. Maybe we even get a bunch of colorless artifact creatures in this set, and we're able to make some kind of a colorless aggro deck using all colorless lands and mitigate the downside of something like this. That could be pretty cool. I don't know, we're going to have to wait and see what else comes in the set, but the potential is there for this card to be nuts. Next up, we've got The Last Ride. Speaking of nuts, this is a 13/13 legendary artifact vehicle for just 1 black mana. What's the catch? It gets -X/-X, where X is your life total. So this is basically a vehicle version of Death Shadow, which is kind of nuts. There is an upside to that, though, that I'll get to in just a minute, that this card has over Death Shadow. It crews for just 2, so any 2-power creature or 2 1-power creatures could crew it and turn it into this behemoth of a vehicle. But it also has this other ability stacked on. Pay 1 black and 2 life to draw a card. So what's cool about this card and what makes it a little bit different from Death Shadow is you can play it early for just 1 mana, and even if you can't really turn it into a creature yet because it would immediately die, it's not a creature right out of the gate, right? It's a vehicle, so you can play it, it's not going to die. It doesn't die unless you crew it, and then it can just sit there, contribute to your board state, count as an artifact for things that care about it counting as an artifact, and give you this draw outlet where, if you want to, you could still draw cards off of this for 3 mana and 2 life, which is not nothing. So I actually think this is kind of cool. It can just sit there, maybe draw you cards, maybe contribute to artifact synergies until you get to a point where you're low on life. And then, oh yeah, by the way, it's also an absolutely behemoth of a vehicle and maybe swings in for a win or blocks a key huge creature of your opponent's. There's a lot of versatility, I think, with what this card could do, and I'm excited to see just how far it's pushed and what kind of crazy decks might be around with this card after this set launches. I'm going to assume that there's going to be some other cards in this set that help you get your life total low or help you pay life for value, and I'm hoping we see more of that, and some kind of a new standard version of Death Shadow could be a viable deck in standard. It's exciting to think about, but we'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got Hull Drifter. This is a 3/2 artifact vehicle with flying for 2 blue and 3, which is a bit expensive, but Hull Drifter's a lot like Mull Drifter, so when it enters, you draw 2 cards. That by itself is nuts. This is going to be a slam dunk pick in Limited. Even though it is a little bit expensive, drawing 2 cards and giving you a 3-power flyer is nuts. Granted, you do have to crew it. and it has crew 3, but there are a lot of pilots in this set that can crew it, even just being negligible little 1/1s, pilot tokens and stuff that we've seen and we will see in some of the other cards we'll go over, and that helps this be a little bit more reasonable. I'm really excited to see how good this actually ends up being in Limited. Probably too expensive for Standard or anything like that, but I am really excited to see if this thing can go the distance in Limited, because I think it's one of those cards that might end up being a sleeper in that format. Next up, we've got Muruganda Raceway. This is another colorless land, but this one's a rare, and it has Start Your Engines. It taps for a colorless mana, but it also has this crazy max speed ability where it taps for 2 colorless mana. So basically, it's a free Soul Ring that uses up your land drop for the turn if you're at max speed. That actually seems kind of nuts, especially in a deck where you're monocolor and you don't need to worry about having as many lands that are getting you multiple colors of mana that you need. Maybe you can afford to slot this in. Much like that last land we looked at, I feel like this might be an obligatory one of in a lot of aggro decks because it's so easy for aggro to just get to max speed. But man, I feel like even in maybe like a burn deck, it is super easy and consistent in burn deck, whether it's mono red or Boros. I've been running a burn deck on the ranked ladder because I hate traditional mono red, and my new burn brew has been pretty fun and interesting and has fast games. But maybe something like that where you just burn every turn, get to max speed on turn 4, and then drop this, and it's just always 2 mana. It never comes out and only gives you 1 mana, and you can play like a 5-drop or something. I don't know. Really, the sky's the limit on the potential for a card like this. Getting a Soul Ring style card in Standard with a condition that's honestly not going to be that difficult to meet for certain decks, for some decks within the format for sure. I'm really excited about just how good this might be. I'm a little bit worried it might be too good, but I'm super excited to see if a land like this can actually make an impact in Standard. If you think you know, let me know in the comments, because it definitely has potential. But next up, we've got Air Response Unit. This is 1 white and 2 for a 3/3 artifact vehicle with flying and vigilance, and it crews for just 1. This is going to be a staple in a lot of Limited decks, I think. I don't think it's quite there for Constructed because it is a bit expensive, and even though it only crews for 1, you do have to still crew it to swing in for 3. That being said, it does have Vigilance, which is really, really nice. You can swing in for 3 just by tapping your 1/1, and then you can also block for with a 3/3 in the air by tapping another 1/1, which is kind of nice. So this one has a chance to be better than it looks on the surface, I think. It might end up being a sleeper, but we're really going to have to see what the rest of the set looks like and how dominant flying ends up being within the Limited archetype before we really know for sure. Next up, we've got Far Fortune End Boss. This is a 4/5 legendary creature human mercenary for 4 mana in the colors of Rakdos. It again has Start Your Engines, and whenever you attack, Far Fortune deals 1 damage to each opponent. So this seems like a decent card to turn on some of those like Lizard tribal abilities we saw in Bloomburrow. Anything that requires damage done for the turn, you get a free point of damage there, which is nice. But the real power of the card lies in its max speed ability. Once you get to max speed, speed of 4, if a source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 1 instead. That's kind of awesome, and it's not like Mechanized Warfare where it's limited to just, you know, red sources and colorless sources, artifact sources or whatnot. It's just everything in your deck that deals damage to anything deals an additional damage, and that just seems awesome. It might be a little too expensive at 4 mana. It is just a 4/5 vanilla creature, other than some of that, you know, damage multiplying. But I still think it's worth trying, especially in the aggro decks that can get to max speed super quick. If this just consistently always comes down on turn 4 with max speed, that could be really, really good. So I think it is dependent upon how consistent and how efficiently you can get to max speed every single game. Next up, we've got Prow Catcher Specialist. This is a 2/1 Goblin Warrior with haste for 1 red and 1. And it has an exhaust ability. Pay 1 red and 3. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on this creature. Honestly, this is kind of the kind of common I like to see in a set like this. It's not awful on curve, right? Comes down as a 2/1 haster, swings in for 2. It does things that aggro wants to do, even though it's not anything to write home about. But then the exhaust ability gives you a way to turn it into a much more reasonable threat a little bit later in the game, especially when you're kind of running out of gas and running out of things to do with your mana. I think this is going to be really decent and limited, and it's important to remember, guys, that that exhaust ability, any exhaust ability, can only be used once per the game, unless you somehow, you know, flicker a card or replay it or something like that, which for a card like this isn't going to be super useful. But there are a bunch of exhaust abilities that basically function like one-off spells that you will absolutely want to reuse, so I'm excited to explore that kind of playline when we get to those cards. But next up, we've got Redshift Rocketeer Chief. This is a 2/3 legendary goblin pilot with vigilance. Taps to add X mana of any one color, where X is Redshift's power, but you can only spend that mana to activate abilities. So the stronger Redshift gets, the more mana you can get out of Redshift when you tap it, but you can only use them for activated abilities. You want to remember that, that's key. And it has vigilance, so you can actually swing in and then still get the mana, which is nice. But why do you want all of that mana that can only be used to activate abilities? Because it has an exhaust ability that costs a whopping 12 mana, and you put any number of permanent cards from your hand onto the battlefield. See, this is the version of Ghalta, or the Ghalta-like card, that I love. This is so much more interesting to me than just, oh, I somehow got a Ghalta into play, and now I get to play everything. Like, having to build up to activate that exhaust ability, at your opponent getting to see it coming, and trying to play around it, just makes for more interesting back and forth gameplay, I feel. And the fact that you can use the mana for other abilities as well, and not just the exhaust ability, makes this card way more interesting. And if you guys have ideas about other abilities that could be absolutely busted with this card, making tons of mana to use on other abilities, definitely let me know in the comments, because I feel like there are probably some really good examples in Standard of cards that can cost a lot of mana to activate their abilities and give you a ton of value if you can. And if that's the case, those cards are going to get a lot of value out of this, even if you don't use the exhaust ability, or even in subsequent turns after you've already used the exhaust ability and you're still making mana and you're still looking for ways to use that mana. So if you have ideas, definitely let me know in the comments. I feel like there's got to be some crazy stuff out there. But next up, we've got Midnight Mangler. This is a 3/3 artifact vehicle for 1 blue and 1. It has crew 2, so you have to crew it with power 2 or more. And during turns other than yours, this vehicle is an artifact creature. I like this play on the, 3/3 for 2 mana defender that we usually see a card like that in every set, and then it has some kind of condition in order to be able to attack. This is just strictly better than that, in my opinion, because it is kind of like a defender. It's always able to block, but the condition to attack isn't like waiting until a thing happens. It's just crewing it because it's a vehicle. So if you want to attack instead of block, you crew the thing, you attack like a normal vehicle. But if you need to just use it as a defender for the time being, you can do that as well. And it's just a 3/3 defender for 2, which is kind of nice. Next up, we've got Boommobile. Now, this is a vehicle that's pretty gnarly. A 5/5 artifact vehicle for 2 red and 2, and when it enters, you add 4 mana of any one color, but you can only spend that mana to activate abilities. So maybe the Boommobile goes really well with Redshift Rocketeer Chief. I think those cards were made to be played together, huh? But you get 4 mana of any one color. You can spend this mana only to activate abilities, and then it has an exhaust ability. Pay 1 red and 2 and X, and it deals X damage to any target, and you put a +1/+1 counter on this vehicle. It also crews for 2 in order for it to become a 5/5 creature. Wow. This card is bananas. The most important thing I noticed about this card is the fact that you get the 4 mana when it enters, not when you cast it. A lot of times, cards that give you an abundance of mana like that when they enter, they do it specifically when you cast it. You have to cast it. This just gives it to you when you enter. So If you find ways to like flicker this, you can just keep making the mana, which is nuts. And that exhaust ability can get insane. So if you flicker the Boom-mobile, you also reset the exhaust ability and make it so you can use it again. So if you were to find a way to flicker this every single turn, you can reuse that exhaust ability every turn and get 4 mana every turn. How would we do that? I know, Nahiri's Resolve. I already have a crazy deck that does exactly what this card wants. It's called Boomstick, which is kind of ironic. I did not see Boom-mobile coming, but this card slots perfectly into there because we use Nahiri's Resolve to flicker artifacts every single turn. A lot of them make creature tokens when they come into play, so the tokens can be left behind as blockers or attackers or whatever we want when we exile the artifacts again to do it all over again. And we just keep creating insane value every single turn by exiling with Nahiri's Resolve. This fits into that perfect. Every single time we exile it, it comes back, gives us 4 mana, unlocks the exhaust ability again. We have all of our lands untapped to use it to its full extent, not to mention all the other artifacts coming into play, and re-triggering there enters the battlefield triggers. This card could be nuts in that deck, and I'm absolutely going to have to brew an update as soon as this set drops, because this just seems nuts. But I feel like this is good even outside of that deck. So if you have ideas about a deck you'd want to use this in, definitely let me know in the comments. And if you're interested in checking that deck out, it is on the channel right now. It's called Boomstick. It's in the Brew Crew playlist. Check it out and let me know what you think. But next up, we've got Venomsac Lagak. Say that 3 times fast. A 2/1 Lizard Mount with Death Touch for 1 green and 1. Already pretty decent. It saddles for 2, and whenever this creature attacks while saddled, it gets +0/+3 until end of turn. This is actually pretty awesome. Not only does it keep them from attacking with their high value targets because they don't want it to trade in combat with your Lagak, but the Lagak can actually safely swing in a lot of times by saddling it and threaten the Death Touch so that they don't want to block it, especially because it's not easy to trade with it. If they have to trade their 4 power creature for your 2 power Lagak, that is not a good trade for them. So most of the time, if you do saddle it, they're going to be in a very bad position where they either lose something really substantial in order to trade with it, or they chump block it, or they just let you through. And all 3 of those are good for use, so kind of an awesome card. I think this might be a sleeper hit, a sleeper pick for commons, in green specifically. I think this card might end up being way, way better than people will give it credit for at first glance. But next up, we've got Caradora, Heart of Alakria. This is a 4/2 legendary human knight for 4 mana in the colors of Selesnya. When she enters, you may search your library for a mount or vehicle card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. So 4 mana is a lot, but at least you get 4 power so that this can trade with something reasonable, while also getting to search for your best mount or vehicle card and just straight up putting it into your hand. That seems really good, but the value doesn't stop there. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature or vehicle you control, that many +1/+1/+1 counters are put on it instead. So if you don't trade this for your opponent's 4/4 or whatever, and keep it around, you can get even more value off of it by just getting extra +1/+1 counters on your stuff. And that makes me think there's gotta be some kind of a standard deck that Wizards has in mind that utilizes a lot of mounts and or vehicles along with +1/+1 counter synergies to get the most out of a card like this. I'm excited to explore that because I definitely have mount and or vehicle decks in mind that I'm brewing for this set when it drops. And I definitely have +1/+1 counter decks in mind that I'm brewing, specifically the Agatha's Soul Cauldron decks. I got a bunch of different ideas for that. But is there a deck that can use both and make great use of Caradora? We're going to find out. We're definitely going to find out. But next up, we've got Light Shield Parry. This is 1 white mana for an instant. It has cycling 2, so if you don't need it, just pitch it and draw a card, which is kind of nice. I like having that on an instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Not the most interesting card in the world, but having a combat trick that can be ditched to draw a card when you don't need that combat trick is not the worst. I could see this being at least reasonably playable in limited. Next up, we've got Bulwark Ox. As if we haven't seen enough crazy cards that are good with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. This is a 2/2 creature Ox mount for 1 white and 1. Whenever this creature attacks while saddled, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So kind of like a Luminarch Aspirant, just needs to be saddled. It only saddles for 1, which is really awesome. And then it has a sacrifice ability. Sacrifice this creature. Creatures you control with counters on them gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. This card is bananas. This card is going to be way, way, way better than anyone realizes at first, I think. I don't know, maybe people will realize. But even with the Agatha's Soul Cauldron example, like, this starts dishing out counters on your creatures so that when it comes time to use your Soul Cauldron, you already have a bunch of creatures that are ready to use Soul Cauldron abilities because they already have counters. Not only that, it can sacrifice itself to get itself into the graveyard so that you can exile it with the Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So that you can give all of your creatures that have a +1/+1 counter on them, which you've already prepared the board state with, the ability to sacrifice and give everything hexproof and indestructible. That seems insane to me. Every single creature on the board can be sacked to protect every single creature on the board. If that's not a recipe for brokenness, I don't know what is. That sounds bananas. But even in fair decks, getting to dish out +1/+1 counters like a Luminarch Aspirant and then also having the ability to sack to protect your board just seems good even when you play this fairly. So I think this card's going to end up being absolutely bananas and a staple in a lot of decks. I think it's going to end up being way better than anyone gives it credit for. And it's going to be completely busted with Soul Cauldron, especially with some of the other cards we've seen that are crazy with Soul Cauldron like Loot. I can't wait, man. That deck's going to be bananas. That deck is going to be the deck of early access, kind of the way like Zur Overlords was the deck for early access in Duskmourn. So, man, I am excited to brew. Bring it on. But next up, we've got Streaking Oil Gorger. This is a 3/3 vampire with flying and haste for 1 black and 4. It has Start Your Engines, and at max speed, it has Lifelink. Just a simple creature, but the Lifelink is huge. Honestly, a 3/3 flyer for 5 is a bit expensive even for limited, even with the haste. But it's really the max speed that makes it worth it because you don't need to worry about achieving max speed when you play this. As long as you can achieve max speed at some point in the future, you can start gaining back life if your opponent was winning the race and then eventually get there. So even if you kind of lose a little bit of tempo playing a 5-drop like this to only have a 3-power flyer, you can make up for that as soon as you get to max speed. Start winning the race all over again by making up, you know, some of that life that you've lost over the game. So I actually think this is a little bit better than it looks on the surface. But next up, we've got Zahur Glory's Past, a 3/2 legendary zombie cat warrior for 2 mana in the colors of Orzhov. So this can go in a zombie deck or a cat deck, or maybe both. It has Start Your Engines. And at max speed, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token. So all of your non-token creatures just start making zombie tokens when they die, which is awesome. But what makes this even better is it has another ability, sacrifice another creature to surveil one, but you can activate only once each turn, getting to dig for the card you need while also giving you a free sacrifice outlet to generate these 2/2s, or to sacrifice things that you want to sacrifice for other reasons in a sacrifice style deck. We've seen in the past that having free sacrifice outlets can be super, super powerful. So having a free sacrifice outlet like this that also includes its own payoff built into the card, and it's all on a 3/2 sort of above rate on rate creature for 2, and in 2 very relevant creature types, I think there's potential for this guy to see a lot of play in different decks, but I'm most excited to try it in tribal decks, whether it be cat or zombie, especially zombie because it's giving you zombie tokens when your things die. So if you have zombie payoffs like lords and stuff like that, the tokens are going to get that much better. Just a lot to take into account and to try to do with this card. I think there's a lot of potential to brew with it. I am so excited to dive in. But next up, we've got Starting Column, another common. This is a 3-mana artifact with Start Your Engines. It taps to add a mana of any color, and then at max speed, you can tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards and discard a card. This is a really good mana rock for limited specifically. It's going to be way too slow for standard, but being able to get card advantage in the late game out of your, ramp, your mana rock that you're playing on curve to start putting out some bigger stuff, seems pretty decent. So if you want a mana rock in your deck, this is probably one of the better ones for limited. Just get you that card advantage a little bit later in the game. Next up, we've got Cryptcaller Chariot. This is a 5/5 artifact vehicle for 1 black and 3. It has Menace, it crews for 2, and whenever you discard 1 or more cards, you create that many tapped 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. It doesn't have to be crewed and be a creature for that ability to be turned on either, which is awesome. You just jam it out there for 4, and for the rest of the game, every time you discard, you get a 2/2. This seems like a really good answer to a lot of the nurturing pixie decks that we've seen. All of that cheap early discard, like Hopeless Nightmare and Tiny Bones joins up and stuff like that. Now, everything they make you discard is just going to give you free 2/2s that you don't even have to pay for, which could be kind of bonkers. That being said, I am a little bit worried about it costing 4. By the time you play it, your opponent might have already made you run out of cards in your hand. They might have already played the majority of their discard spells. So it's tough to say how good this will actually be, but the potential is definitely there, especially in like a Golgari deck where you can play like turn 1 Llanowar Elves and get this out a turn earlier on turn 3. That could be a lot better. So the potential is there for this card to be really, really good. I think we're going to have to try it out and see it in practice before we really know if it's good enough. But next up, we've got Cloudspire's Sky Cycle. This is a 2/3 artifact vehicle with flying for 4 mana in the colors of Boros. It crews for just 1, and whenever this vehicle enters, you distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 other target vehicles and or creatures you control. So it can't put its counters on itself, not even one of them like the other one that we saw. But a flying vehicle that crews for just 1 that gets you extra value and distributes counters is actually pretty decent in limited. Flyers in limited are going to be great as it is, but the versatility of being able to kind of spread out the power and toughness you get from this card so that if your opponent has removal, you don't lose all of it, makes it especially good. Next up, we've got AetChick, I don't know, some chick, Emerald Radian. This is a 3/3 legendary insect druid for 6 mana in the colors of Golgari. That's a lot, but it's got some pretty crazy abilities. When this chick enters, you create a 1/1 green insect creature token for each artifact and or creature card in your graveyard. So maybe in an Insidious Roots deck, because that can ramp you up the kind of mana you need for something like a 6-drop early, while also having potentially a ton of creatures in the graveyard to give you a whole bunch of 1/1 insects? Maybe. We'll have to wait and see. But the other ability is whenever another insect you control dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on this chick, and each opponent loses 1 life. So if you can go super wide with insects and then just have a sacrifice outlet and sack them all, you can just drain them out and kill them in 1 shot, which seems kind of awesome. And the more I think about it, the more I realize this is really meant to be played with Insidious Roots, because the fact that you're making 1/1 insect creature tokens, and Roots gives you the ability so that all of your creature tokens can tap for mana. So all of those 1/1s will also be able to tap for mana to play some kind of crazy big spell. Maybe a crazy big spell that gives you a whole bunch more insects or something, and then you go crazy with sacrifice outlets and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. I feel like there's a few different ways this can be used, but I guarantee you all of them revolve around using Insidious Roots because it just seems like the perfect match. But next up, we've got Boosted Sloop. This is a 3/3 artifact vehicle with Menace for 3 mana in the colors of Izzet. It crews for just 1, and whenever you attack, you draw a card and then discard a card. So nothing crazy good. It's nice that it has Menace so that you can attack in more often and get that trigger without putting your vehicle in harm's way. But this is just meant to be kind of filler within certain vehicle archetypes within Limited, and I think it will fill that role decently well. Next up, we've got Sita Varma, Masked Racer. This is a 2/3 legendary creature human rogue for 2 mana in the colors of Simic, and it has an exhaust ability. You can pay 3 mana, 1 blue and 2 green, as well as X, and put X +1/+1 counters on Seat of Varma. Then you may have the base power and toughness of each other creature you control become equal to Seat of Varma's power until end of turn. Maybe this sees play with some of those red cards we saw earlier in the video that give us a bunch of mana we can only use for activated abilities, although that might be a stretch as far as color commitments. But at the very least, just playing this 2 mana 2/3 that just sits there and dares your opponent to let it live until eventually one day down the line you have a bunch of mana and you just alpha strike out of nowhere with an insanely powerful board, it could be pretty interesting. I'm excited to see how realistic this ends up being. It is kind of expensive and it doesn't do anything outside of being a 2/3 until you decide to pull the trigger on that exhaust ability. So I am a bit skeptical about this one. I think this is one of the most likely to be traps in the set that we've seen so far. But it still seems kind of interesting. And like I said, we do have a bunch of cards we've seen already that give us a bunch of mana to use specifically for activated abilities. So it's possible there could be some kind of crazy, I don't know, Temur deck or something that just goes absolutely nutty with mana early from stuff like that and can activate this relatively early in the game, and that could be kind of bananas. So I don't know, we'll have to see what other cards come in the set. But next up, we've got Guidelight Pathmaker. This is expensive. A 6/5 vehicle with vigilance for 6 mana in the colors of Azorius. It accrues for just 2, which is nice. And when it enters, you may search your library for an artifact and reveal it. Put it onto the battlefield if its mana value is 2 or less. Otherwise, put it into your hand and then shuffle. This card is absolutely bananas for limited. It is a bit expensive. It's going to be very hard to justify putting more than one of these in your limited deck. But being able to search for any artifact is nuts. If you get any artifact bomb whatsoever, especially if it's within these colors, picking up at least one of these is a no-brainer. Because if you can just get to the mid to late game, get to that 6 mana point, now you get to search up your bomb and make sure you have it, and you're almost guaranteed to win the game unless your opponent is putting way too much pressure on you and they're going to kill you first. But most of the time, if you can search up your bomb, you're going to win. And we've already seen some pretty crazy bomby artifacts in this set already, and I'm sure there are a bunch more on the way. So I do think this card is worth heavy consideration in limited as a one-of. It being 6 mana, I don't think you want to risk playing with more than one. But I don't know, it could end up surprising us, especially if there's a lot of different ways to ramp mana and get this out a little bit more reasonably. We'll have to wait and see. But next up, we've got Captain Howler Sea Scourge. This is a 5/4 legendary shark pirate for 4 mana in the colors of Izzet. So pretty on rate. I would even say above rate because it has ward, pay 2 mana and 2 life, which means it's going to be a lot harder for your opponent to deal with. And that's pretty nice on a 4 mana 5/4, but it also has this ability whenever you discard one or more cards, target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn for each card discarded this way. And whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player this turn, you draw a card. So even if you discard a whole bunch of cards all at once, every single one of them is going to give +2 power, which is nice. You could use this in some crazy decks with things that discard your whole hand at once. There are absolutely tons of ways to do that in Standard right now. But the thing that excites me the most is maybe using this with things like Carnosaur or the black 5-drop that you can discard for 2 mana and give something -2/-2. Stuff like that, where you're able to technically get value, play removal, you know, get value like you're playing a spell, but you're technically discarding the card, and you also get to trigger the Captain Howler. I think both ideas are worth exploring as far as how you discard your cards and what you get out of it. A lot of interesting ways to get value off of this for sure, but even just a 5/4 for 4 that protects itself with a hefty ward seems pretty awesome. So if you have ideas about the best discard outlets to use with this to just get an insane amount of triggers, definitely let me know in the comments because the potential is there. But next up, we've got Thunderous Velocipede. This is another mythic. It's a 5/5 artifact vehicle with trample for just 2 green and 1. It accrues for a whopping 3, So that does make it a little worse. Granted, there are a bunch of pilots in this set that could potentially crew this a lot easier, but it's the ability that makes this card so good. Each other vehicle and creature you control enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it if it has mana value 4 or less. Otherwise, it enters with 3 additional +1/+1 counters on it. So even if you play this fair, all of your creatures are entering with at least 1 counter, and if they cost 5 or more, they're entering with 3, which is nuts. It also means every 2-power creature that you play that has mana value 4 or less is going to enter as a 3-power creature and be able to crew the 𝑉𝐴𝑙𝑜𝑐𝑖𝑝𝑒 by itself, which is something to take into account. Because it's at least dishing 1 counter out on every creature that enters after this, you can almost effectively kind of see this like it has a crew 2 ability, because you're going to be able to, you know, boost up every single creature you play after this to be able to crew it even if it's only at 2 power, which is really, really awesome. But I think what makes this card so good and will be the most overlooked is the fact that it's not a creature card you're playing from your hand or a vehicle card you're playing from your hand that gets these counters. It's just literally any vehicle or creature that enters with an additional counter. So anything that makes token creatures, especially cards that are constantly spitting out token creatures every single turn, stuff like 𝐒𝐏𝐻𝐈𝐋𝐄, all of that stuff is going to trigger the 𝑉𝐴𝑙𝑜𝑐𝑖𝑝𝑒, and all of those creatures are going to get counters, which is nuts. Granted, they won't cost very much, so they'll only be, you know, 1 counter on each of those tokens, but getting a free counter on every single token you create seems nuts, with the upside of, if you do occasionally play something that costs 5 or more, it's going to come in with 3 extra counters. That just seems bananas. I think this is another one of those cards that's way better than it looks on the surface. It might be a bit of a sleeper. I'm really curious to see if people catch on to how good this actually is during spoiler season, or if it's going to take them until the set actually launches. But I think this one it'll be very easy for this one to slip under the radar, I think. But next up, we've got Kaladin, Triumph Caster. This is a 2/3 legendary human pilot for 2 mana in the colors of Boros. Mounts and vehicles you control have haste. Full stop. That's already really good if you're playing a mount or vehicle deck. Just all of them can be used the turn that you play them. That's kind of good. But whenever a mount you control enters, it becomes saddled until end of turn, and whenever a vehicle you control enters, it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. So not only can they all attack the turn they enter the battlefield, but they all they all get mounted or crewed for free, which is crazy to me. Just, I don't even know what I would do with this guy, but he seems super, super busted in the right deck. If you're just super wide with mounts and vehicles, everything attacks with haste and doesn't need to be crewed and doesn't need to be saddled, that's almost like you're tripling your value, because you're playing your thing, but you're getting haste, which means you get to use it now instead of waiting. But then, even better than that, you get to use it without having to tap your other creatures to crew or saddle them, which means your other creatures can also still attack when under normal circumstances they wouldn't be able to. So it really is almost like you're tripling your value off of each vehicle the turn you play it. I don't know. I feel like in the right deck, this could be busted. It has to be just the right deck. And in those decks, it is an easy target. It dies to pretty much every piece of removal ever. But the potential is there to do some really disgusting things and have some really disgusting turns with a card like this. So, man, I'm excited to brew with it. Next up, we've got Valor's Flagship. Talk about busted vehicles. This is a 7/7 legendary artifact vehicle with crew 3 and flying and first strike and lifelink, and it costs a whopping 7 mana, 3 white and 4. But you can also cycle it for 1 white, 2 colorless, and X. Not only do you draw a card if you cycle it, but when you cycle this card, you create X 1/1 colorless pilot creature tokens. With this token saddles, mounts, and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. So this is a way to give you all of those pilots that you want to crew all of those vehicles. But it gets a little crazier because Greasefang is a thing. Greasefang already has the Parhelion, but what if you had a crazy big vehicle that didn't need some other way of putting itself in the graveyard. What if it could just put itself in the graveyard from your hand? That's exactly what this is. You cycle it, you put it into your graveyard, you don't even need to worry about milling it or playing some kind of spell where you draw, discard, or any of that garbage. You just use its own ability to put it in the graveyard, and then it's there waiting to be brought back for free with Greasefang. And then when it gets bounced to your hand, you could just cycle it again if you want and make even more pilots. So Greasefang constantly returning this to your hand and pulling it out of the graveyard, cycling it, and the more mana you have as the longer the game goes on, the more pilots you can make every time you cycle it, and you just keep repeating the process. Kinda seems bananas. But the thing I'm excited about the most for this card is, are we going to get a new version of Greasefang in this set? Something that will be standard legal. Will it be possible to do any kind of anything that resembles Greasefang shenanigans from Pioneer in standard? Will there be cards that you can put to great use with big vehicles being in your graveyard? Man, I hope so, because having some kind of a standard deck that can do something along those lines just kind of seems busted. So I'm excited to see just how crazy this card can go once we have the entire set unveiled. But even for just now, the card seems kind of nuts. Next up, we've got Pyrewood Gearhulk. This is the second in a cycle of Gearhulks we're getting in this set. This one is a 7/7 artifact creature construct with Vigilance and Menace for a whopping 6 mana in the colors of Gruul. And when it enters, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Menace until end of turn, and damage can't be prevented this turn either, which means if you're at speed 3 and you're just trying so hard to get to speed 4, even if your opponent has like a fog in hand, they're not going to stop you, right? So, pretty cool. It does seem a bit expensive, and the ability is a little bit underwhelming, but it is an alpha strike. It's almost like an overrun effect that you kind of get for free on top of a huge body, and that seems kind of cool. Maybe playing it in a deck with something like Enduring Courage, where you can always give it that +2 power buff and haste, so it can contribute in the same attack that it buffs everybody up in. Maybe something like that could be really cool. I don't know. You're going to have to let me know if you've got any ideas about how you would use this, what kind of standard deck you would brew with this. I think maybe the thing that's most likely, some kind of elf tribal deck, where you use this at the top of the curve in a similar fashion to how Craterhoof Behemoth is used in elf decks in older formats. So maybe something like that it would end up seeing the cut in, but we'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got Oil Deep Gearhulk, the third Gearhulk in the cycle. This is a 4/4 artifact creature construct for 4 mana in the colors of Dimir. It has lifelink and Ward 1, which is actually a pretty decent body. But when this creature enters, you get to look at target player's hand, you can choose a card from it, and if you do, that player discards that card and then draws a card. It is a bummer that they get to draw a card. I have a feeling that in playtesting, this was just discard a card, and it ends up being way too good. But, you know, them getting to redraw a card to replace it makes it a little bit more balanced. But don't get your wires crossed. This is still insanely good, right? Getting a relevant 4/4 lifelinking body that your opponent has to pay more mana in order to kill because of the ward, that also gets rid of the best card in their hand when you play it, regardless of if they draw another card or not, is still awesome for 4 mana. I don't know how much play it will actually see, and if it will be as good or better than other 4-drops available in Dimir, but it definitely has the possibility and the potential of doing that, especially in decks that are already trying to utilize some sort of, you know, discard synergies. Maybe you can get even more value off this. And it's worth pointing out that if you're playing something like Sheoldred in your deck, them having to redraw a card to replace their best bomby card that you made them discard also has some upside to it, where you get to make them lose 2 life when they draw that card if you have Sheoldred out. So I definitely feel like this card has the potential to be way better than it looks. And you shouldn't underestimate getting to make them discard literally any card on ETB, even if they do get to draw a card to replace it. But next up, we have Quag Feast. this looks like a very fun piece of removal. 1 black and 1 for a sorcery. You choose target creature, planeswalker, or vehicle. You can kill any of those 3 things. You mill 2 cards, and then destroy a chosen permanent if its mana value is less than or equal to the number of cards in your graveyard. This is super good. This is another one that's way better than it looks on the surface. The fact that it mills 2 cards for you means it's never useless on curve. Even if you don't have anything else in the graveyard, on turn 2, you can mill 2 cards and kill a 2-drop for 2 mana, which makes this on rate with most of the removal you want to use. The downside to this card in particular is the fact that it's a sorcery, which is kind of a bummer. But even at sorcery speed, I feel like the versatility of getting to choose a creature, planeswalker, or a vehicle, along with the fact that you get to mill 2 cards, makes this a prime candidate, especially if you're in a deck where you really want to mill for other reasons. If you're in some kind of like a Jund Delirium deck or Threshold deck, or any kind of self-mill deck where you want to fill up your graveyard as quickly as possible. Now, that mill 2 cards isn't just a way to ensure that you can kill the thing you want to kill, but it's almost 2-for-1ing. It's getting your removal spell, but then also getting to mill cards, which is what you want to be doing on turn 2 or even later turns anyway. So it's a way to not have to stop playing cards that mill you in order to use removal if you need to use removal. You're still getting the milling that you'd want to do. Sure, maybe it isn't in Overlord of the Baelmerk, maybe you're not milling, 4 cards, but getting to mill cards regardless and still kill a thing instead of having to choose one or the other at a key turn in the game where you have to make sure you keep milling cards and fill up your graveyard as quick as possible could be nuts in the right decks. So I'm going to absolutely use this. I have a few different decks in mind where we want to fill up the graveyard quick. I have a Jund Delirium deck I think this would be awesome in. I also have a newer deck that fills up the graveyard quick, uses Likeness Looter, uses Fling effects, and uses creatures that get bigger based on your graveyard. I think this would be a prime piece of removal in that deck as well. Both those decks are live on the channel, so check those out if you're interested. But yeah, I think this card's going to end up being way better than it looks, as long as you're in a deck that wants to be milling 2 cards on turn 2. It's a way to have your cake and eat it too, and I love that. But next up, we've got Hazoret Godseeker. Can confirm Hazoret is the returning god in this set. He is a 5/3 legendary god with indestructible and haste for just 2 mana, 1 red and 1. But obviously there's a stipulation because he's a god. He has start your engines, and he can't attack or block unless you have max speed. So you have to be aggressive, you have to make your opponent lose life every turn, and once they've lost life, 3 turns in a row, or not even in a row, just over the course of 3 turns at some point, you can get up to that max speed of 4, and then this is a 5/3 attacker or blocker with indestructible, and it has haste, so even if you top deck it after you already have max speed, you can just jam it and swing in for 5 for 2 mana, and that seems kind of bananas. Honestly, the more I think about this, the crazier it is. What if we just play this as the only creature in a burn deck? And we don't have to worry about our opponent blocking or anything. We just burn them on turn 1, 2, 3, 4. The only thing we'd need is a way to start our engines on turn 1. So how busted this guy ends up being really depends on how many ways we have to start our engines on turn 1 without those things being a waste of a card. If there are any burn cards that also start your engines, good god. That's a deck, guys. That's going to be bananas. But the cool thing about Hazoret is even if it can't attack or block, it has so much upside built in. For only 2 mana, you have this last ability here where you can pay 1, tap him, target creature with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn. Start making something unblockable every single turn, which gets even better if you have things that trigger off doing combat damage to the opponent, like drawing cards and stuff like that. But it's also still a 5/3 body, even if it can't attack or block. So if you're running like fight spells, you can have Hazoret fight something, deal 5 damage, and it doesn't matter how much damage the thing does back, because it still has indestructible, even though it's not a creature yet. You can use bite spells, of course. Just You could fling this if you wanted to and just do 5 damage to the face, even though it can't attack or block yet. I feel like there's a lot of different ways you can utilize this card that aren't obvious at the outset, and I can't wait to explore every single one of them. But that burn deck, man, I am hoping we get something that starts our engines. If we could get like one mana burn spell that's like 2 damage to only a creature and start your engines or whatever. Because if it dealt damage to the opponent, that would be crazy, right? You'd start your engines and then immediately go up to speed 2. That would be bananas. So I don't expect to see that. But even if it was just like a 1 red mana, do 2 damage to any creature, start your engines. And then maybe like a 1-drop creature that starts your engines. We just need 8 cards in the deck. We just need 8 1-drops in the deck that start your engines. And the rest of the deck can just be Burn and Hazoret. And it would be absolutely bananas. I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Let me know in the comments how you feel about something like that. And if you have any other ideas that I haven't covered with this card, because I think the potential is through the roof. But next up, we've got Repurposing Bay. Talk about potential through the roof. This is an artifact for 1 blue and 2. You can pay 2, tap it, sacrifice another artifact. Search your library for an artifact card with mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrifice artifact's mana value. Put that card onto the battlefield and then shuffle. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is basically a birthing pod in blue for artifacts instead of creatures. And it's kind of insane. Honestly, the more you think about this card, the crazier it is. First of all, there are a lot of really good 1-drop artifacts in Magic the Gathering. So being able to sacrifice artifact tokens, which are in complete abundance, to just find whatever 1-drop artifact you want, could be absolutely busted. I don't know if it is. I'm going to have to like think about it more and kind of dig in and really see what kind of brew we can put together. But just that alone could be kind of busted. Just sack your tokens to find actual 1-drop artifacts every single turn. Seems nuts. But the way that I'm most excited to use this card is with Leyline Axe. Could you imagine starting the game with a Leyline Axe in play? And then just like, you don't even have to worry about playing big artifacts the rest of the game. Like, play Llanowar Elf on 1, play Repurposing Bay on 2, turn 3, sack your Leyline Axe, get a 5-drop artifact into play, and still have mana left over to do other stuff. I don't know. Man, there's so much potential. Not to mention artifacts that have enters the battlefield abilities, eggs and stuff that draw you cards when they enter. You can sack them to find the next more expensive thing, one cost more, and then still get, you know, your ETB triggers off of things. If you can put together an artifact food chain where the artifacts entering are getting you ETB value and then being sacked again to find the next thing, stuff like Chainsaw, oh my god, there's so much potential for a thing like this. So much. You could sacrifice, what's that 3 mana blue artifact from the big score that makes artifact creature tokens every time you play an artifact that costs 3 or more? Or every time an artifact that costs 3 or more enters, I think it is. Because you could sack that to find your Thousand Moon Smithy, which is kind of the same thing if you wanted to. You could also sacrifice 2 cost artifacts to find the 3-drop. You could do a lot of crazy stuff. Even just eventually getting to a really expensive artifact by using this every single turn and never having to commit all of that mana to hard casting the expensive artifact. It's just costing you 2 mana every single turn. Getting a head start with the Leyline Axe, right? Sacrificing the 5-drop you find off of Leyline Axe to find a 6-drop and then a 7-drop, and eventually getting to like Portal to Phyrexia or something. There's so much potential with a card like this, and there's going to be so many lines we need to explore, so many different brews that we need to really think about. So we got to hit the ground running, guys. If you have ideas of things to dig into with this card right now, definitely let me know in the comments, because I'm sure there are going to be a ton of brews with this card coming as soon as this set releases. But next up, we've got Agonisaur Rex. This is an 8/8 dinosaur with trample for 2 green and 3. It also has cycling for 1 green and 2. And when you cycle this card, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 target creature or vehicle, and then that creature or vehicle gains trample and indestructible until end of turn. So this is an interesting card. My gut reaction says it's supposed to be in a Reanimator deck, because you cycle it, you get the value off of it, and then you put it directly onto the battlefield. But at the same time, a 5 mana 8/8 trample is so above rate that you kind of want to hard cast it, right? So maybe you're just playing a green aggro / mid-range deck, and this is your 5-drop, but like, if the situation's right, you instead cycle it to just win, or you cycle it in response to your opponent trying to kill a thing because it gets indestructible. There could be, I don't know, man, there could be a lot of different ways to use this, but I can't really think of the best way off the top of my head. Maybe just in a dinosaur tribal deck. We've got some crazy dinosaur synergies that are still alive and kicking from the Ixalan set. And yeah, maybe we could get this out cheaper with some of the mana production that we get that can only be used for dinosaurs. Maybe we work this into just a straight up dinosaur deck where this thing comes out even earlier, turn 3 or 4 maybe. Who knows? Excited to explore the different directions this card can go in. I would say this is one of the least exciting rares we've seen, because it does what it does. But I am excited about the potential of like a green Stompy deck being relevant again. And if this is another card that just increases the chances of something like that happening, that's not nothing. Next up, we've got Chandra Sparkhunter. We finally know what Chandra in this set does. This is the Planeswalker of the set. She is a 4 loyalty legendary Planeswalker Chandra for 1 red and 3. Feels good to get another 4-drop Planeswalker, to be honest. She has a static ability. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you choose up to 1 target vehicle you control, and until end of turn, it becomes an artifact, creature, and gains haste. So, one of my theories going into spoiler season was that Chandra was going to be able to somehow crew vehicles for free, and now we have confirmation that she does exactly that. But not only that, it gets haste, which I didn't see coming, which is awesome, and you don't have to use a loyalty ability to do it. It's just once per turn you get to do it. It's kind of like the Kaito that is a creature on your turns. Chandra just like activates a vehicle on your turn. The one downside to that is that you don't have a way to crew a vehicle with Chandra when you're trying to be defensive with the vehicle and block with it. You can only do it on your turn, so that kind of emphasizes putting her into a more aggressive deck. But to make up for that, you do get the haste on the vehicle, so even a vehicle that you play that turn, you can immediately swing in with by turning it into a creature for free and giving it haste with Chandra. And we haven't even got to the loyalty abilities yet. For +2, you can sacrifice an artifact or discard a card, and if you do, draw a card. So it gives you a nice way to get some card advantage, especially if you have artifact tokens to sacrifice, or if you have cards in your hand that you want in the graveyard for some reason. You can get even more value off of an ability like that. But the 0 loyalty ability is what makes this really interesting. You create a 3/2 colorless vehicle artifact token with crew 1. So that's way better than I was expecting. I was theorizing when we knew this set was coming, and we knew that from Maro's spoilers, Maro's teasers, we were going to get a vehicle artifact token. I was theorizing that it might either be a 1/1 that crews for 1 or a 2/2 that crews for 1. And I wasn't sure if the 2/2, if something like that would be too powerful. But now we have confirmation it's not a 2/2, it's a 3/2 that crews for 1. And that just seems insane to me. Granted, you do need to crew it, but still, being able to make every single one of your 1/1s, like, turn on a 3/2 so that you can trade a 3/2 with one of their creatures and then keep your 1/1 seems kind of nice. The fact that this can spit out a 3/2 vehicle literally once a turn every single turn for 0 loyalty is kind of nuts. And then if you don't have a good vehicle to play to use Chandra's static ability on, you just use the vehicle token that you just made, turn it into a creature for free, and attack with it with haste. So at the very worst case scenario, you could just do that, and that seems kind of awesome. But then it also, you have a -7 ability here, an ultimate, where you get an emblem with whenever an artifact you control enters, the emblem deals 3 damage to any target. And that continues to trigger every time you make one of those vehicle tokens, which is kind of awesome. I don't know. This just seems kind of nuts to me. You could play this on a board with a fully leveled up Innkeeper's talent, and it comes into play with just 8 loyalty right off the jump, and then you just immediately -7 to get the emblem, and now all of your artifacts become like free lightning bolts, and that seems kind of nuts. There's a lot of crazy stuff you can do with this card. I'm super interested to brew with it, especially just like making these artifact tokens, these vehicle tokens. The one thing that I'm really hoping for, and we don't know yet, I hope Chandra isn't the only thing that makes these 3/2 vehicle artifact tokens. I hope this is a mechanic that's kind of threaded throughout the set and multiple cards are making these tokens, because I think it's such a cool mechanic. Making vehicle tokens just seems fresh and interesting, and I hope it's not this, you know, fringe thing that's only going to come up once in a while when someone has a Chandra. So fingers crossed there, but even if it is, still a crazy card. I'm really excited to see what we can do with it. But next up, we have the return of an old favorite. Bloodghast is coming back to standard. A 2/1 vampire spirit for 2 black mana. It can't block, which is a downside, but it has haste as long as an opponent has 10 or less life, and it has a landfall ability. Whenever a land you control enters, you may return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield. This card has been proven to be nuts in the past. That being said, aggro is insane in standard right now, so I don't know if it's as crazy as it used to be, just because the bar for how good aggro cards in standard are right now is so high. So I feel like it's a good time to try to reintroduce a card like this where it doesn't completely unbalance the format, because there's already an insane amount of powerful aggro options, but it gives us the ability to really try and work with a card like this that we've been waiting to come back for so long. At least I have. I even have a deck on the channel right now that just wipes the board every single turn with red damage sweepers, but has a way of getting value, constant pressure that we can put on our opponent regardless of it, with things like Urabrask's Forge and Undead Sprinter and Cult Conscript and stuff like that. And this card slots perfectly into a deck like that, so I can't wait to iterate on that deck and do another version of that when this set comes out using Bloodghast. Man, it's crazy to hear myself say that. Like, Bloodghast is actually going to be in standard again. That's pretty nuts. Do you guys think that this is still as busted as it used to be, or do you think that power creep over the last few years has made standard so crazy ridiculous that this is not going to have as much of an impact as it has in the olden days, in days long past? Let me know in the comments how you feel about it. But next up, we've got Draconautics Engineer. This is a 2/2 Goblin Artificer for 1 red and 1, and it has 2 different exhaust abilities, and both of them are kind of nuts. The first one is just 1 red mana, other creatures you control gain haste until end of turn, and you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Honestly, kind of nuts. Being able to turn your 2/2 for 2 into a 3/3 for just 1 mana, while also giving everything else that you play that turn haste, just kind of like for free, is super on rate. I think this is actually one of those cards that might be a sleeper for aggro decks, especially Goblin tribal decks. I feel like there's just a lot more potential in this card than people will realize at first, but its other exhaust ability is where it really it really goes off the rails. This is 1 red and 3, create a 4/4 red dinosaur dragon creature token with flying. Now, you gotta remember, exhaust abilities can only be used once for the entire game, unless you find a way of, you know, having the engineer leave play and come back somehow. Then, you know, it'll count as a new copy of the card and you'll be able to use it again. So flicker decks could be cool. But even just, you know, having this mana sink you can use later in the game when you're out of gas in your aggro deck and you've already played out your whole hand, now you just have like this thing where you can make a 4/4 flyer. Seems kind of nuts. So I actually think this card is really good. It's super on rate when you take into account its first exhaust ability, and then it's chock full of value when you take into account its second exhaust ability. And another important thing to denote here is it might look on the surface like exhaust is kind of like level up in a way, but cards like this that have multiple exhaust abilities, you don't have to do them in a certain order. So even though one is way cheaper than the other, and most of the time you'll probably use them in that order, you don't have to. This could come down off a top deck later in the game, and you could immediately make a dragon. Or you could do both in the same turn. You could pay just 7 mana, playing this from your hand, give everything haste, put a +1/+1 counter on the engineer, and swing with the 4/4 flyer because it has haste. Like, that's a thing you could do, which seems kind of nuts. So, I don't know. I think there's a lot of potential here. I think the more potential there is for goblins as a tribe to be a relevant meta deck in Standard, the more potential this as a card has to actually make an impact on Standard. So, well, we'll have to wait and see where goblins land. But next up, we've got the return of Basri as a legendary creature this time. This is Basri, Tomorrow's Champion, a 2/1 legendary creature human knight for just 1 white mana. And don't let the fact that he's a human knight fool you. This is absolutely a cat tribal card through and through. It has a 1 mana exert ability, pay 1 white, tap him, exert him to create a 1/1 white cat creature token with lifelink. You can also cycle him for 1 white and 2, and when you cycle him, cats you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. I already put up a short on the channel for this spoiler card, and one of the comments that I saw on that short was, man, I really want to use this in my cat tribal deck, but it's a shame he's not a cat. I think that just edges him out from making the cut. And I really don't see it, because no matter what, even if you play him as a creature, he might not count as a cat himself, but he creates a cat to replace himself. So even worst case scenario, turn 2, you could play another 1-drop cat and exert him to make a cat, and he made a cat to replace himself as if you had just played a 1-mana cat in the first place. Well, I guess it would cost you a total of 2 mana. So maybe it's not quite that simple, but it does have lifelink, right? And then because of exert, it's not exhaust, right? It's exert. So you can use that ability basically once every other turn. So it gives you this way of getting a cat token, and even if they kill your 1-drop, you still have the cat token, and if they don't kill your 1-drop, you're making 1 cat token every 2 turns and getting just more value out of it the longer the game goes. And I think once you put all of those pieces together, he's absolutely worth the cut in a cat tribal deck. Even just as a 1-mana 2/1, maybe you're not even using the exert right away, you're just swinging in for 2 damage on turn 2, and then maybe turn 3 when you can't swing because they have like a blocker or whatever, then you're starting to make cat tokens. There's a lot of value, and you don't have to worry about drawing multiple copies of this because it's got the cycle ability, which will not only draw you a card to replace it, but also give all cats you control hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, make your cat hordes survive wrath effects, survive targeted removal, survive bad blocks if you're trying to alpha strike in, all of that stuff. And I think the versatility of being able to do that while drawing a card, and it being uncounterable since it's a cycling ability, that's another thing that's easy to overlook. You're not casting a spell to give everything hexproof and indestructible, it's uncounterable, which means even if you're up against a counterspell deck, you're cycling this, you're discarding it and getting that ability, so it's an uncounterable way to give everything hexproof and indestructible. And it's a creature in the early game that is a Savannah Lions that can swing in, that can exert itself to make cats. Like, everything about this card is awesome, and the more you start to think about it, the more you realize this card is nuts. And I think if people start to think the way that one guy did that left that comment, they're absolutely not gonna see what's in front of their eyes. Like, this might end up being a crazy sleeper. I have a feeling most people will recognize how good it is, but if you don't, this is definitely going to be a sleeper that's going to be bananas for people that don't see it coming. Yeah, the more I think about this card, the crazier it is. But that brings us to our last card of the day. Man, so many cards today. This is Sab Sunin Luxa Embodied, a 6/6 legendary creature god with reach, trample, and indestructible for 5 mana in the colors of Simic. Now, 5 mana is kind of a bargain for all of that, but there's a catch. Sab Sunin can't attack or block unless it has an even number of counters on it. What's cool about this hoop that you have to jump through is it's something that switches back and forth over time, but you have some amount of agency depending on how you put your deck together in sort of deciding whether or not it does. And I think that's really cool. It makes it way more interesting than the gods we've gotten in the past that just turn on their indestructibility at some point or turn on being a creature at some point and then they just are. I like the ebb and flow that this kind of card sort of represents, but its other ability is where things get really crazy and off the rails. At the beginning of your first main phase, you put a +1/+1 counter on Sabsunin, and then if it has an odd number of counters on it, you get to draw 2 cards. So without any other extra manipulation, this is just going to draw you 2 cards every other turn. Every other turn, you just draw 2 cards. It's an indestructible creature that just sits there, drawing you cards, and is really, really hard to kill, drawing you 2 cards every other turn. Like, that alone seems awesome. The fact that you can play it in a deck with +1/+1 counter stuff to manipulate the counters means you could possibly just draw 2 cards every single turn, which gets even crazier. But then, it's even better than that, because if you want, you can attack and block with it if you have an even number of counters on it. Which means you could theoretically start the turn by drawing 2 cards, not being able to attack, put a counter on it with something, like maybe Collector's Cage would be a good option, turn on the ability to attack with your indestructible 6-drop, or 6-power creature, and then at some point it gets another counter and goes back to drawing you 2 cards next turn. If you're able to manipulate this in that way, you draw 2 cards every turn and have a 6/6 reach, trample, indestructible creature that can attack every turn, which is bananas. And even if you don't get to those kind of shenanigans right away, it coming into play with 0 counters and being a creature that can attack or block when it has 0 counters means that the first turn it's in play, it can at least block for you. And since it has reach, it can even block flyers. And it has indestructible, so it doesn't matter how big the flyer is. So it comes down, blocks for you, and then on your turn draws you 2 cards, and then you have all your mana, and you can do whatever you want to manipulate things. If you can get that counter on, you can start attacking and blocking again. Even if you can't, you can start the next turn. Like, man, there's just so much value in this. Even if you play it fairly, it's still a really good card. But there's so many ways to play this not fairly and have your cake and eat it too. And I just feel like this card is itching to be broken. And I kind of can't wait to try and do that. But we're going to have to wait because this is just day 1 of spoiler season. And so many more are on the way. But that's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. Before you leave, please make sure you like this video so it helps me get it out to so many more people. It really does make a huge difference and helps me keep the channel going the more viewers I get. So please, please, please also subscribe if you're new so you never miss an upload. We're going to keep the content flowing, especially this spoiler content. So much craziness, and we're going to make sure we get it out to you as soon as possible. I also put out shorts every day where I cover 1 card at a time when I want to get those cards out to you without having to wait for the time it takes to put these long form videos together. But we're going to definitely do a long form video every single day for every card put out that day. So look forward to those. And also catch me live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/QuarantineCapricorn. Because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. Man, this set is crazy. I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.